Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another fantastic edition of Sitback with Shaq and Anu. We're coming to you live on Channel 1, of course, on Dialogue TV. Also live on our social media platforms on YouTube, Podhub platforms on YouTube. Thanks so much for being a part of the show. As always, fantastic guests on the show every day. And again, today, it's another great show that we have lined up for you. We've got Bhavani Fonseka in the studio. Good evening.
Hi.
And welcome to the show.
Thank you, Shaq.
Lots to talk about today on the show, which we will definitely get into. So, Bhavani, before we actually do start the show, at the beginning of the show, we usually have a daily poll that happens. And more often than not, the question on the poll is either related to the guest or the topic that we're actually going to be talking about. And at the end of the show, we will reveal the answer. So everyone watching us right now on Channel 1 on Dialogue TV will be a part of the poll, and also everybody on social media will also be a part of the poll. Time for us to get into the daily poll. Here it is. Radio, right, here is the question for you for today. Do we know what our fundamental rights are? Do we know what our fundamental rights are? Perfect question for a show like today. Yes or no? All you need to do is go ahead and WhatsApp your answer on 077 669 1590. Do we know what our fundamental rights are? Yes or no? And at the end of the show, we will reveal the answer, and sometimes most of the polls that we've actually had on the show surprised us at the end of it, because here we are thinking this is the way it's going to go, and it's complete different. But I think that's a pretty good point for us to actually kickstart the conversation. Do we know what our fundamental rights are?
That's a good question, but you're asking a lawyer, so obviously I know.
You know.
But I think many people don't even know what rights are.
Right.
And that's a challenge at the moment, because many feel that the state can do anything, there are no protections, or they don't know what they could do in terms of rights and what is possible. So there's a lot of confusion, and I think the confusion also stems from lack of information or just not having the correct information.
Right.
There's a lot of confusion or ignorance in terms of what the rights are, what's possible also in terms of how do you redress, how do you get redress.
Okay, so let's dive straight into the conversation right now. We're obviously talking about our fundamental rights as a citizen of Sri Lanka. In what way are our rights being constantly violated? Now, we're obviously talking about the fact that in the last couple of days, it's a violation of our fundamental rights, and it goes on, and everybody's talking about it. There are press releases. But what is the reason that our fundamental rights are constantly violated over and over again?
So maybe Shaq, just start off with what do we define by rights?
Right.
What are fundamental rights? And not to make it boring, because, let's make it kind of more accessible for people. The Constitution provides for a chapter on fundamental rights that has a range of rights. Now, in terms of the present moment, we're talking about protests, we're talking about freedom of expression, freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, the whole issue of arrest, detention. This is all provided in our Constitution, So our Constitution has articles, and now I'm becoming the lawyer, but specific articles that protect people's particular rights.
Right.
And if there is a violation, basically, if someone from the state violates those rights, they can go to the Supreme Court and file a complaint, file a petition, or to the Human Rights Commission. So there are ways of getting redress. But there is also a lot of discussion now because of what's happened in the recent days, weeks, months, as to right to protest, right to dissent.
Right.
Just looking at what's happening now.
Right.
And those are provided specifically in terms of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of association. So we can kind of think about those as ongoing, and even today there was a conversation, where can people protest, what is their right, what are the protections, can people post things on social media? I mean, that's coming up quite a bit.
We'll talk all about that today.
Yeah, so there are particular rights provided, and to simplify, there's also ways of restricting some rights, not all the rights, but some rights. But that's also provided in the Constitution.
Right.
So the rights are articulated, restrictions are articulated, and the restrictions have to be broadly, without making it very legal, has to be by law. So one can't just say, you can't do it, and issue an order. It has to be within the legal framework. I'm saying that because there's now confusion with the state of emergency and the restrictions. We can go into it a bit later.
We will.
But all I'm saying is it has to be by law.
Right.
And why we say by law is then there is certainty.
Right.
There is no arbitrary action. And again, while I say there can't be arbitrary action, of course there are.
There is.
So, you know, what's in the law and what's implementation is very different. And that's the problem.
Right.
That's where the violations occur, that's where the confusion happens. So, but basically everyone should be able to look at the Constitution if they're interested. Or if not, there are various very easy, as we call idiot guides to explain this. But also to be very aware that no one can just arbitrarily take away those rights.
See, this is the problem, isn't it? Because, I mean, just as our poll said, I mean, we don't know our fundamental rights. We don't know our rights. You being a lawyer, it is a requirement for you to know your rights, right?
I would think so.
Yes, right. It's obvious, right? Yeah. Now, for us, at the end of the day, if someone like you come and tell us, you know, this is a violation of someone's rights, we will automatically just believe you, right? So it boils down to interpretation. So this is the question. I think in one of our first shows that we had the president of the Bar Association on the show with us, and Salia Pires, and we said, listen, why is it not taught in schools? Why do we need to get into law school? And a lawyer who needs to tell us what our rights are. I mean, we're citizens. Why can't we not go into that grassroots level and explain what our rights are?
Well, I think there's some work being done. I mean, by association, organizations I work with, there is some work being done. But granted, it's not enough. And it's not going to across Sri Lanka. That's the problem. It's very limited. But there's also a lot of tools now online on social media that's accessible. Whenever we try to talk about laws, I've realized the non-lawyers keep saying, please explain it, please unpack it, please make it visual. So that's what we're trying to do. I mean, for example, we are trying to do a document explaining what the emergency regulations are at the moment. And I can assure you, even as a lawyer, I have so many questions that we've now made it very simple, explaining things. So we need to think about how do you make things more accessible, not make it so legal, because we are so good at saying article XYZ says this, section 2.3 says this.
And you lose them at that point.
Yes, you lose the audience, I agree, and we learn through that. So much work to do, but I agree with you in terms of why not make it part of the education, like go to the schools, go to uni, make it much more publicly accessible, definitely. And that's a problem, that people are not aware of their rights, but how to redress if there is a wrong also is not freely available. So many think if there is a violation, they have to pay a lot of money and they can't go to court, and that is not always the case. There are ways of doing it without spending so much money. So I think we need to address not just what the rights are, but also in terms of access also.
I think that's also pretty much a loophole that I suppose the state wants, that doesn't want to educate individuals on their rights because they can do whatever they want to do. which we unfortunately are seeing what is happening, so which we will also get into that. Let's talk about the peaceful protest that obviously has been taking place over the last 100 days. You've worked very closely with them also. In terms of where we are right now, the protesters have achieved much more than we thought they will ever achieve, and it's a huge plus point, and it's just gone such a long way right now. But where do you actually draw the line when a peaceful protest becomes violent? That seems to be the issue. Now, I mean, to be fair, Bhavani, at the beginning, everybody was part of the protest because everyone was going through almost the same problems. Not that they're not going through the problems right now, but over a period of time, things started taking a different shape and individuals wanted to start stepping out. So it basically went, more violent. Where do you draw the line?
So, Shaq, I think it's very important to look at the protest in terms of where it started from,
Right.
but also looking at it in terms of Sri Lanka's own history.
True.
I mean, a lot of people think this is something new. I mean, this came in a vacuum and, how did it happen? But I think it's so important to also look at Sri Lanka's own past and the decades-old struggles. I mean, citizen movements, protests, dissent is very much part of Sri Lanka's history. And there's been quite a lot achieved through these protests. Much of it is peaceful.
Right.
Some have turned violent, but
Right.
much of it is peaceful. But one thing I'll also say is the intimidation, the harassment, all of that also the protesters have experienced
Right.
in different ways.
Right.
Now coming back, I just wanted to make that point because many forget
Right.
the struggles in the past and ongoing struggles
Yeah.
across.
Yeah.
And in Sri Lanka, I would also say, in the present years, we talk about what started in March with the economic crisis, but the protests in the recent years also started with the fishermen,
Yeah.
with the militarization or attempts to militarize education, the farmer protests with the fertilizer ban, a whole host. So it's very important to recognize all of those struggles as well. But what happened in March, or starting from March, are these citizen-led, very small protests, pockets that started in the suburbs. Kohula was the first.
Yeah.
A few individuals started.
Yeah.
I remember going early March, and there were only a few of us.
Right.
And, numbers grew, it spread to other areas, and the whole idea was if you can't go to Kohula, start your own.
Right.
Start in different places.
Right.
So Tungmulla, Rajagiriya, and out of town, out
Yeah.
of Colombo. And those initial weeks were quite interesting to see how far can you go.
Yeah.
I mean, what would this lead to?
Right.
9th of April happened, and then it was this Gulf-faced epicenter, massive, so it changed.
Right.
But coming to the whole point of violence, the first time we saw violence in this particular spate was on the 31st of March
Right.
in Mirihana.
Right.
Until then, we didn't see that kind of violence. Now, questions are being raised as to who instigated that violence,
Right.
what happened, what was the purpose. And just to keep the point is, emergency was declared that night.
Right.
A state of emergency. We'll get to that. But it's very important to understand some of the violence is followed by particular responses by the state.
Right.
And we've had state of emergency now thrice in Sri Lanka this year.
Right.
The 1st of April, 6th of May, and now we're in a state of emergency. I'll just say it and
Yeah.
we can go into it a bit later. But there is a particular response from the state also that comes with these kind of incidents. I would say largely the protests have been peaceful. We need to recognize that.
Yes.
People have come to the streets to raise a point, to raise the suffering, the hardships, but also demanding for change,
Right.
demanding that this kind of governance the corruption, the abuse of power needs to stop, needs to change. And those demands were articulated as resignations, as bringing in new checks and balances, all of those things. So largely the protests were peaceful, but violence did happen.
Right.
But most of the violence that occurred came from particular sections. May 9th in particular, the violence started from the then Prime Minister's official residence, supporters going and beating and using excessive force against 2 protest sites at that time.
Right.
On Friday or Thursday night, Friday morning, we also saw violence coming from the state side.
Right.
So there's a particular trend from state violence, state instigating. But there's also been incidents where there's been also protesters for particular reasons to respond to the violence also. There's been some force use. So there are questions as well. But I think it's very important to understand it's been peaceful protests which has led to violence for particular reasons. Now that needs to be unpacked as well.
Right.
But who gains from the violence also needs to be questioned. What comes following that violence? The emergency is one. Curfew came soon after much of these incidents as well. So why is that happening? And one of the points I would say is there is this default position that many governments resort to is repression, using emergency or security laws to really hit back. So these are also things we need to really be thinking about. You can't put the blame on the protesters when it comes from the state, and excessive force by the state.
So let's talk about the emergency regulation which is imposed right now. Now, of course, it was imposed by the then acting president, now, of course, elected president. What are the conditions a sitting president can enforce the emergency regulation?
So we talk about the executive president having very broad powers.
Yeah.
And that's also connected to one of the demands of the protests is abolishing the executive presidency. We can go into it a bit later, but the powers to impose emergency is with the executive president. Whoever holds that office has that power.
Right.
And it's very much within the executive arm. So you have a particular power by the sitting president who can impose emergency. And for 14 days, it's with the executive arm. That's the president.
Right.
Within 14 days, it has to be presented to Parliament.
I believe it's going to be presented tomorrow.
So this is quite timely to see how Parliament also, whether they refuse or whether they allow the emergency to happen. But one of the questions to pose to everyone is to understand why is emergency brought. Sri Lanka has a history, decades of emergency being enforced, largely during the war, it was there, but even post-war.
Right.
Soon after Easter Sunday attacks, we had emergency. Last year, the then President, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, brought emergency for essential items in terms of addressing maintenance of essential items. This year, the emergency has been largely on the public order, public security. Now, the question now is, did we really have a situation to bring in emergency when the acting president brought in? And that can be debated and that can be challenged in the Supreme Court. In May, when it was brought in, and in April, when it was brought in by the previous president, cases were filed. So there are cases in the Supreme Court challenging those sets of emergency. Whether it meets the threshold of public security and public order. In my opinion, there are lots of questions. Is there a situation when emergency was declared that warranted emergency? Because Sri Lanka has a whole host of laws. We have the Penal Code, we have the police ordinance. So the authorities, the law and order authorities, can use other laws to bring in, if there is unrest, if there is violence, they can use that to bring in some sort of calm.
Right.
Even the Public Security Ordinance, which is used to declare emergency, has particular sections that can be used to impose curfew without having to resort to emergency.
Okay.
There is also a provision to bring in the military, calling out the security forces.
The sitting executive president has that.
All this is with the president.
Okay.
You don't need to declare a state of emergency for
Right.
those things. And that has been happening for a while now. So it's not new.
Right.
Sri Lanka, unfortunately, because of the conflict, the crises, this has been used over the decades by successive governments, by successive presidents. So the question now is, do we need emergency? In my opinion, I don't think so. Existing laws provide for that. But if you look at the emergency regulations, and that's the worrying thing, there's a whole list of offences, powers that the government can have, the power to arrest and detain, which is very worrying.
Which is what I'm going to get into next, and of course also letting our viewers know if there are any questions you have for Bhavani, by all means please send it in to us. The number is on your screen right now. You can also basically send in your questions, and be more than happy to obviously answer the questions for you at the moment. I think we do have a few questions which we will put up on screen. That's your number, 077 669 1590. On the emergency regulations, what are the repercussions of the state of emergency for the citizens?
So there are different things that could be that could happen. I'm not saying it's definitely going to happen, but
Right.
emergency is very broad.
Right.
So for example, I think 2 days ago we got this news report that someone was arrested for posting on social media.
That's right. I mean, I think it was actually today this came out as far as
Yes.
news is concerned for hate speech.
Yes.
And showing dissent.
Yes. So there is when you look at the emergency regulations, and us lawyers tend to go over this, there is a provision which says if there can be disaffection, there can be, and it's very broad, and
Right.
that's something I want to say is that posting things on social media, conveying something that could be fake, preventing essential services from taking place, obstructing roads or protests could be stopped using emergency. That is possible in the present emergency.
Right.
There is quite a bit of broad language, and there's also provisions that they have brought in from the Penal Code into the emergency as
Okay.
well. So I'm just kind of keeping it very basic here, but the question is, why bring penal code provisions into emergency?
Right.
Penal code is our criminal law that is already there in the books. Why use emergency? Now, emergency also provides people to be detained for 72 hours, and then the DIG can issue a 2-week detention order. That's also extremely problematic because anything could happen in that 72 hours or the 2 weeks. I mean, lawyers do have access, but we have a history of torture, of cruel, inhuman treatment, and these are cases that's decided by courts. So one asks the question, why do we need all of this in this present moment, is there a question of public security, public order actually happening in Sri Lanka? I don't think so. I mean, there are protests, but that's not a public security issue.
Right.
So it comes back to who decides, who defines these things. And the Supreme Court over the years, again, apologies, I'm trying to keep it simple.
No, that's fine.
They have questioned
Right.
the use of emergency for different reasons, and has actually said that there has to be a particular reason
Right.
connecting to public security or public order. You can't willy-nilly just go and declare emergency.
Right.
There's also safeguards provided by
Right.
Supreme Court in several judgments say right to protest, right to dissent should be part of democracy. So there's also pushback from the judiciary in some instances where there's been particular violations. In April, it was very interesting when there were several cases filed in the Supreme Court challenging the proclamation, not emergency regulations. The Supreme Court actually gave leave to proceed. So leave to proceed, just to explain, is there is recognition by the Supreme Court that there's a matter to be gone into.
Right.
So that means they're not saying there is a violation, but it needs to be looked into further.
Right.
So in April, the Supreme Court this year said leave to proceed granted. That was in April. May we had emergency declared again, and we now have emergency declared again. So interesting legal questions as well in terms of, is there really a genuine need to declare emergency, or is this a default of successive governments because they're used to it, because it's there, because it's easy, because it just provides broad powers to the authorities to do anything they want to? What's different now is there are more and more citizens questioning, critiquing, challenging, and that's important.
Right.
That one can question. Of course, questioning could also land you in trouble, but I think it's very important we don't give up on questioning, that we don't push back. And I would say it's very important to critique the present state of emergency and emergency regulations.
Going to get just the question I want to basically get into in terms of the Supreme Court. If you say that the Supreme Court is looking for an avenue. Actually, before that, Bhavani, I think we have a question from Kevin on the screen right now. Is there any use in knowing your rights in a country with so much corruption, which is why most people have no faith in the legal system?
Of course. I mean, and I say this as a lawyer, but any citizens, if you know your rights, I mean, that's so important. If you know what the legal provisions are, what your rights are, the legal avenues available, you can challenge, you can critique, and you know what you're doing is right. And, you know, one of the things the protests have shown is citizens can come in, can critique, can challenge. And I would say use that legally, democratically. Don't use violence, but knowing your legal rights can open up so many avenues and also empowers you, because no one can say that is not your right, that is not your job. As a citizen, you should be able to do anything you want to within the legal framework, within the democratic space. I'm not saying anarchy or something, but so much can be done if you know your rights. So it's so important. But the question is, how do you then get this knowledge? And this is the challenge we're also facing.
So now, in terms of the emergency regulations which is on right now, I mean, obviously in a time of economic instability and there's a political chaos that is going on, of course, the judiciary most probably must be questioning, is this the time for emergency regulation, which is something that I'm sure that most of you lawyers are arguing for and against. But do you not feel the emergency regulation that possibly has been brought about is purely because of the fact that the protests have gone violent? If it was a peaceful protest like it was for like 75 odd days, would we have actually come to this point right now?
Well, I mean, Shaq, this is why it's important to look at the whole timeline of emergency, protest and emergency.
Right.
That's why I keep going back to this spate of protests started in March.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, but we're looking at emergency at the latter part of it when...
No, but we've had 3 sets of emergency declared this year. So understand, why is emergency then brought? You know, I mean, violence suddenly erupted 31st March.
Right.
Questions are raised as to what was the reason, who instigated. Just like that, 1st of April, there is a state of emergency.
Right.
Coincidence. I mean, there were no regulations even issued. It was just a declaration of a state of emergency. Interestingly, 2 days later were those massive protests, 3rd of April. Now the question is, was the state of emergency brought then to stop those protests happening?
Right.
So what was the justification?
Right.
That's why it's so important to ask these questions. Because people, regardless of emergency, came to the streets.
Right.
They didn't care because
Right.
civil disobedience happened. And surprisingly, the government revoked those emergency the state of emergency in April. In May, on the 6th of May, emergency was declared again, and 9th of May was when the violence erupted. None of these two incidents came from peaceful protesters, the violence on those days. If you really look at things, what's been documented now, that violence transpired from different entities. Why was emergency declared at those times? So again, we need to question. Now, there's been some instances where violence has been present in the recent weeks, but if you also look at it, the recent weeks saw a lot of violence coming from the state side.
Right.
Even on the 9th of July, when hundreds of thousands of people came, we also have seen now images where tear gas was used,
right,
where brutal force was used against protesters. And then you had emergency declared a few days later by the acting president. Now, declaring emergency, as I said, is with the president.
Right.
But it has to meet particular standards. You can't just bring it because someone feels, personally, I want to declare emergency,
right,
because there are existing laws. It's extremely dangerous in a democracy when you keep going back to security laws if there is no situation that warrants the state of emergency. When it becomes the norm and not the exception,
right,
that is very, very worrying.
So that is where you feel that we are at the moment, because for every little thing we just keep falling back to the emergency regulations.
And when there are existing laws that can bring the situation under control. Now, I also want to say, on the 8th of July, before this big protest, we also saw the police saying, police curfew.
Right.
Yeah. Now I'm just using these examples. Police curfew,
right,
on that Friday.
Right.
9th of July was the big protest.
Right.
Many of us question, what is this police curfew?
Right.
Many would say, and this is why again I come back to this point of knowing your legal rights. What is the legal framework? Would say, yes, of course, police have the right to impose curfew. They have particular rights, but there's nothing called police curfew in the law.
Right.
You know, curfew can be imposed again using particular laws. So the PSO, the Public Security Ordinance, does provide paths, but that's with the president, not the police. So one has to question, one has to critique. So on the 8th of July, the Bar Association, several lawyers, many of us put it on social media saying there's nothing called police curfew. What is going on here? As a result, the police quickly retracted that statement and people just came to the streets. I think people would have come regardless.
True,
you know?
true.
People wanted to protest. But you have to keep questioning, you have to keep pushing back, because otherwise a state that wants to control, wants to stop people from peacefully doing what they want to do, will use anything, which is not even the law, to try to stop, try to repress. So that's why going back to the whole knowing your rights is important, but also knowing what is in the legal framework, whether it's used properly. So to say, but emergency is there, the executive can impose emergency, that's not the question we should be asking. We should be asking is the situation so dire? Is it an exceptional situation that threatens the country that an emergency needs to be declared? Otherwise, use existing laws.
On the subject of police curfew, Bhavani, I think I've heard this police curfew that's been declared many times before, right? Nobody spoke about police curfew till the 8th of July. Nobody pretty much came out and said police do not have the jurisdiction to, of course, enforce curfew, because there have been other cases where we've come about and said that there's a police curfew enforced in this area. Everybody just shut their mouth and waited. During the lockdown,
yes,
there was a police curfew.
Yes.
None of you came out and said you can't enforce it.
We did.
Why
you don't read our documents.
No, I don't think so. Maybe you weren't as vociferous.
I wasn't invited to your program. That's the problem.
We didn't.
So next time.
We want a lockdown, right?
So I wanted to come back to this point, because even during lockdown, there was something called quarantine curfew.
Never heard of that.
Because it's not there in the
Right,
law.
okay.
Yeah? But it was used by the then government to say people stay at home. Now,
Right.
one of the things we need to recognize is there was a public health
True.
situation that warranted certain measures to be taken.
Right.
Now, those steps needed to be taken within the law. Now, I'm happy to share those documents. As lawyers, we did critique what quarantine curfew was. And many, actually, including lawyers, pushed back on us saying, how dare you talk about, challenge this when the public health situation warrants a lockdown.
Right.
We said, no, we're not opposed to a lockdown. Do it legally.
Right.
Impose the curfew legally. Don't create these arbitrary practices because it sets a precedent.
Right.
Then next time you say, but we did it then, why can't we do it now?
Which is the case.
Which is the case.
Right.
So with police curfew, people have questioned.
Right.
There are lots of people who have questioned over the years.
Right.
Even before I started this work,
Right.
people have questioned. It gets lost in the system. Now, during the war, again, this public security notion was used to defend anything. Public order, public health. So these are always used to justify positions taken, restricting rights, and a lot of the times people just take it. But what is happening now is just that critique,
Right.
that challenging, that pushback.
Right.
And in a democratic way, in a peaceful way,
Yes.
people are, what are you doing? What's going on?
Right.
And I think it's also partly because of social media.
Yeah.
Social media provides that platform.
Very much.
I think earlier we didn't have that. We would rely on mainstream media, we would rely on print media, which was slower.
Right.
We couldn't take particular positions, we couldn't air our views. Social media now provides
Right.
a huge avenue, and people get aware of the rights, aware of the situation. So on the 8th of July, when the police curfew was imposed, people were like, what's going on? And quickly got the information and said, no, we're still coming. We're still coming to the streets because there's no legal basis.
Right.
So connecting to why is it important to know the law? You have to have the platforms to know the law. But if you know the law, you can also push back.
Right. Right.
So affirming your rights as well.
Yep, so that's something that we obviously have heard over the years, this police curfew thing I've heard over the years, and to be honest, I think it's the 8th of July that, a fair amount of people actually realize there is nothing called police curfew.
But the police does have power
Yes.
to take measures within their areas. I'm not saying it's not there, police ordinance provides it, but not police curfew.
Right.
So I think we need to now very much question, if they say there's police curfew, question where is the police curfew, where is it provided?
Right. Gayani has a question for you. Does Amnesty International strongly condemning the pre-dawn attack by security forces on peaceful protesters at Gota Gogama have any use to people exercising their human rights?
So the question is...
It's an interesting
Right.
question, actually.
Yeah.
Try and decipher this question. Does Amnesty International strongly maybe condemn the
Yeah.
pre-dawn attack by security forces on peaceful protesters at Gota Gogama
So,
have any use to people exercising their human rights?
So by Amnesty condemning, is it useful for people? Is that the question?
I'm not too sure. Maybe Gaini, if I'm sure you're watching us, maybe if you could just rephrase the question as to exactly how you want to get about it, because that is what we're going to get into right now, straight after. Now we're looking at the cleanup of the protest site. Can you actually call it that? I'm trying to be very diplomatic here. You can call it whatever you want. That's perfectly fine, which happened after midnight on the 22nd. So we hear two sides. One side, of course, which claims that they're just the clearing process was done according to law, right? There's another side, which is a larger side, right, which basically claims the fact that the way it was done was illegal. And there's a violation of human and fundamental rights at that point. Firstly, explain this court order to us. Was there a court order?
The court order for the statue, you mean?
Whatever the court order?
Yeah, so I think there's confusion
Yes.
also in terms of What was the court
Now,
order?
the reason I'm asking you, Bhavani, is because there is definitely a school of thought saying they can do this because there was a court order. Nobody knows what the court order was. Nobody knows the particulars of the court order. Does the court order cover what happened the other night?
Other night meaning
The
Thursday night,
22nd,
Friday morning.
yeah, that's right.
As a lawyer, I have to keep asking you, what night? What are you talking about? No, so can I be very clear? Even if there is a court order, looking at the images that have come out, and I'm going by what's on social media, what's on mainstream media, the excessive force used against people, peaceful protesters, trying to flee, raises the question of, was that the force used, was it proportional? Was it necessary?
Right.
That's one question. And also in a context where the protesters said they're going to vacate, leave the presidential secretariat. So was it necessary that the excessive force that was used in the night, what was the thinking? Why couldn't they do it in the morning? Why couldn't they do it in the afternoon? So it raises a lot of questions. And that's why it's very important to ask these questions. What the timing, the force use, what was the legal basis? Now there is this, before that, there was a court order to vacate the area around the statue.
Right.
And 50 meters.
Right.
Now,
sadly, I think 4 individuals were actually arrested today.
Yeah. So that's an ongoing case,
Right.
and I think we need to be careful in terms of ongoing cases.
Right.
We have to see what happens. But that's 50 meters.
Right.
That didn't extend to the presidential secretariat and the other areas.
Right.
Because the images that have come out and people who were witnesses saying they were on the road, they were trying to leave, and they were forcefully taken, they were
Right.
beaten. And what was that necessary? What was the objective of that? We also saw journalists attacked. We saw lawyers attacked.
Right.
So there's a whole host of individuals attacked. And what was the reasoning for all of that? Who gave the order for this? I mean, these things need to be questioned.
Yeah.
We are not a court of law, but these things need to be questioned. And I suspect there may be cases filed, so
Right.
this can be gone into. My personal opinion, and this is my personal
Yeah.
opinion, is what happened on Thursday night, Friday morning, was a complete excessive use of force by the state. The violence came from the state. The protesters, I haven't seen any images where the protesters are attacking
Right.
security forces. So if there's nothing to show that the violence came from the protesters, if there is, show that.
Right.
In the absence of such information or images, then was that force use, can it be justified? What was the need to bring in the troops? We are not at war.
Yeah.
I mean, I can understand if there was a war going on. The images we saw was of combat forces.
Yeah.
Was it needed in Colombo?
Right.
When the protesters had said they're going to leave.
Right.
So what is this thinking? So is this the mindset of the rulers, the military, and what is the objective? Is it just to stop people from coming to the streets? Are we going to go into a new era where that's how they respond to people peacefully protesting? All these things need to be questioned. But my opinion is it was excessive force.
But is the state legally covered under the state of emergency to go ahead and do what they did?
They can come and debate that. I mean, that's why one needs to question, why do we need a state of emergency?
But can they, is the question.
So they can take that position.
Right.
If I have a case, and if I file a case, I can say, no, the force use was excessive.
Right.
Now, there's cases, the Human Rights Commission has also come out and said that declaring a state of emergency is provided by law if you meet particular standards, but it has to be legal, it has to be proportionate. It needs to, I mean, is there a need? Is there a necessity? And again, that's why I come back to those questions. What was the need for a state of emergency? What was the need for such excessive force? So the government could defend, and that's their right. If there is a case, they can defend. But I think it's important for us as citizens to keep questioning as well, keep pushing back as well. Because if we don't challenge what happened on Thursday night, Friday morning, this could repeat itself. We already have seen in the last few days some who've been imposed travel bans, some who've been arrested. There's intimidation now used. There's fear among the protesters who've been at the site that they could be targeted.
Right.
Now, if we don't question and challenge, this could continue. I think the state is quite used to using repression against its own citizens. I don't think this is a new thing. So that's why it's important for us to keep pushing back.
Now, the condemnation from the world, I'm going to get this question into it, Chatu, before I give you the one. As an activist on a scale of 1 to 5, where do you think Sri Lanka stands on, number 1, the right to life and liberty, number 2, freedom from slavery and torture, number 3, freedom of opinion and expression, number 4, the right to work in education? I'm glad she stopped at number 4. Otherwise we'll be carrying on and we might have to basically present a paper. Chatu.
We can have a separate show on this.
Yeah. So.
I mean, look, it depends who you ask, but if you look at the recent events, I mean, if you look at what happened in the last few days, our liberty is at stake. People have been assaulted. There's potential evidence of torture. So on several of these counts, on freedom of opinion and expression, if people can't express their view and if they're arrested for posting things on social media, I would say all of those 3 have been violated to some degree.
Right.
But just to kind of, you need to be more specific in terms of looking at the evidence. But I think all the first 3 have been violated in different instances in the recent days and weeks. Right to work and education, look, one can say, and labor rights is very important. I think this is something to look into, but again, what's the context you're looking at? Education, the fact that students have not been able to go to school for so many weeks because of fuel and other reasons, there is an issue there. The fact that not everyone has access to education, that also can be questioned. So I would say all 4 areas, there are violations, but without generalizing, it's important to also look at very specific instances when saying there is a violation. But I would say there's enough evidence to say there are violations in all those areas. But just as a lawyer, I'm going to say is show examples.
Right. Be more specific.
Be more specific. So but definitely, I think, Chatu, you raise a valid point. There are violations, and that needs to be looked into.
Okay, so we're into the final 10 minutes of the show. Don't even know where time flew. So much we obviously are talking about now. Going back to the attack, so to say, at the protest side. Now, of course, we had condemnations coming from world over, right? The question that I actually have for you, the condemnation is on what exactly? Is it the act itself, or is it how it was done, or is it the timing of what happened?
So there's been a whole lot of condemnation, both from Sri Lanka as well as international. So it's not just international condemnation. I think many citizens in Sri Lanka were shocked as to what happened, why it happened. And I think as fellow citizens, if we truly value our democracy and the rule of law, we need to condemn this, what happened.
Right.
So it's the act as well as the nature of the scale of the violence and whether it was really needed.
Right.
Internationally, there's been condemnation from a whole host of entities. And I think that will have implications for Sri Lanka's economic recovery. But a lot of the condemnation I saw was raising concerns of the excessive force that was used.
Right.
And just the violence.
Right.
And I think that's very worrying that we have to see all of this kind of unfold, but also realize we're going to the international community for assistance at this grave moment, but the international community is saying, what's going on here? You know, you need to get your house in order. So it's extremely worrying that they have to issue certain statements to a newly elected president, by the way.
Yeah. What did they actually clear at the
Who
protest site? The state or the military or the forces or whatever. What did they clear at that point? What was the requirement to clear the presidential secretariat? Was it to clear the protest site? What did they clear?
So they claim that they wanted to take the presidential secretariat, but this is why it's very important to understand the protesters said we are going to clear the presidential secretariat the next day.
Right.
So that's the question is, why did they use force to then clear it? So
Okay.
the state took back control of the presidential secretariat and that area, and they barricaded that area that morning and no one could go in. So they were able to claim that area. But it goes back to the question is, why did they do it when people were saying we will give that area back, we will give the presidential secretariat back? So this goes back to the heart of the question is, was force needed when the protesters themselves said we will return to the protest site, we're going to give this back?
What is the legality in forcibly occupying a government building?
So I think you had this question last week as well.
Yeah.
So there is a question in terms of public property. I mean, if there is...
So why wait for protesters to give you a time frame when you are sitting in somebody else's property? So as the state, they want their property back. They could do it whenever they want or however they want.
No. So they can take public property. I mean, yes, there is a law.
Right.
But the question again is how you take it back, whether excessive force is needed to take
Wasn't
it
it
back.
forcibly taken?
Forcibly taken, but was there violence used in terms of really, did the protesters attack anyone when they took it over on the 9th of July?
Questionable.
Questionable. Everything is questionable.
Yeah.
And at
it
least
wasn't. They didn't walk in.
They
It wasn't-
walked in.
I mean, it wasn't open to them. There was a struggle.
Yes,
There was some sort of violence.
there was a protest. I was there on the 9th of July,
Right.
and I have to say, even I was surprised that they breached
Right.
they breached the presidential secretariat, they breached the official residence of the
Right.
president. But if you looked at the images, I mean, there are reports coming that there was theft, all of that. This needs to be investigated.
Yeah.
All of this needs to be investigated. But people went in and peacefully occupied. We saw images of people working out, having meals. I mean, I didn't see violence.
Right.
But then let the state prove if there was violence, let them prove it. That doesn't still justify the state using violence. The state is supposed to protect citizens' rights, not just go and undermine and use force and attack citizens. So, the state has the primary duty to uphold and protect and promote human rights.
So the state, basically what I'm trying to tell you, is state has requested the government property to be given back many times. But supposedly, right, it has fallen on deaf ears. So why would the state want protesters to tell them this is the time we are going, when the state can say, you're sitting in our property, we want it when we want it?
Well, let me be very clear. When you say state property, one of the things we need to be very clear is this is public property.
Okay.
Yeah, this is not one individual's property.
Right.
This is state property. It's held, it's for the use of the public, so it could be for official work, all of that. Now, that doesn't mean anyone can just go and occupy
Right.
and disrupt functions, all of that. Granted, there is a law, that law needs to be respected. If the law is wrong, we need to then try to change the law.
Right.
You don't use violence as a means to try to change things.
Right.
I agree with that. But I come back to this question of, say the state was trying to say, please leave, we want to take this back, we need to get back to work, this is a public property, this is the presidential secretariat, and it fell on deaf ears. Is it still justified to just use force the way they use force, to use the military?
Right.
Then couldn't it be the police who, it's a law and order situation, the police could have done this. Do you need armed ninja-style men going in and attacking citizens? So those questions need to be challenged. I mean, I would be very worried if we just take someone from the government saying, we tried our best, so we brought in the troops. This is not a war.
Right.
These are citizens for months who've been demanding for change. Respect those demands. Don't use force. Engage peacefully. Fine. If it's difficult to get through to them, use other peaceful means. Don't use force just because it's available. And this is this mindset of Sri Lanka, that we feel violence is the way to go forward. Using security laws is the way to go forward. That needs to be changed.
Rightio then. 2 more minutes to go before we are done with the show. Quickly, Bhavani, now how do we, as normal citizens, tread on things with the emergency regulation intact? What are we supposed to do? What are we not supposed to do?
Is this a separate show? Because
go on, is it?
We can go on. But I would say first, understand what is in the emergency. I mean, just to plug something, we will have some simple information coming out that will be available just to say this is in the emergency regulations.
Right.
But one of the things I want to say is a state of emergency should not be normalized.
Right.
It's an exceptional situation when emergency should be imposed. This particular regulations is very worrying.
Right.
It infringes on many rights, and we need to really carefully monitor how it's going to be used. Already there are concerns as to how it's being used. How it could be used further is also a concern. But let's watch what happens tomorrow in Parliament. Let's see what the parliamentarians decide, because now it's up to the Parliament to vote on it tomorrow.
Right.
They could decide that we don't need emergency and refuse to vote. I mean, refuse to endorse it, basically. Then
Right.
emergency ends. So tomorrow is an important day. If they decide to continue with emergency, then we need to really monitor how it's going to be used, because it could impact all of us. And that's a very, very worrying situation.
Right. Time for us to obviously reveal the poll that we started off the show with. And the question was, do we know what our fundamental rights are? Yes or no? All you had to do is WhatsApp your answer to that number. Everybody watching us on Channel 1 Dialogue TV, and also everybody on social media, on our PodHub platform, 077 669 1590. I hear a deep sigh from you, Bhavani, because you're wondering which way is this going to swing. Let's find out the answer. The answer is 40% say that we're aware of our fundamental rights. This is an absolute failure as a country.
Yeah.
60% of individuals who are watching us right now
Don't know
their fundamental rights.
So, Shaq, I think you need to have more programs like this. I think that's the lesson, that you haven't done your job.
Well, there you go. Unfortunately, it boils down to us as usual, the scapegoat. But thank you very much, Bhavani. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for being a part of the show. Learned a lot. Of course, wanted to find out so many questions that are in the circles at the moment, and it's been an absolute treat having you on the show. Thanks so much. Hopefully we'll have you back on the show very soon.
Clearly we have a lot of work.
Yeah, we do. 60% amount of work to be done, actually.
Clearly.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being a part of the show. So sorry, unfortunately, Anu is still not here, not feeling all that well, but hopefully we'll try and get him off his tush and be back with us very soon on the show. So we have another fantastic guest coming up tomorrow night at 10 p.m. right here on Channel 1 Dialogue TV and of course our Podhub platforms. Have yourself a wonderful night and we'll speak to you soon.